When I made more money than I needed for my personal use or for the benefit of my family, and making money running a hedge fund is quite a painful, very strenuous occupation. I've reflected, why should I do it? What am I going to do with this money? I really went through an extended period of reflection, and I came to the conclusion that what I really care about is a rather abstract idea, which is the idea of an open society. I then decided to set up this foundation, Open Society Fund, with the objective of opening up closed societies, helping to make open societies more viable, and fostering a critical mode of thinking. There are basically two major sources of poverty and misery in the world today. One, Jeffrey Sachs explained to us, is bad location. The other is bad government. And that is something that you could really do something. Now, I think the one thing you can do is to offer incentives, encouragements, reinforcements to countries that are moving in the right direction. Giving money away in a funny way is much more difficult than making it, because when you make money, you have a bottom line, and it tells you, are you successful or not. When you try to, let's say, improve society, you affect different people and different interests differently, and they are not actually commensurate. So you very often have all kinds of unintended adverse consequences. So I had to experiment, and it was a learning process. The first part was this subversive activity, disrupting repressive regimes. That was a lot of fun, and that's actually what got me hooked on this whole enterprise. Then, after, as the system started, the communist system started to collapse, one had to build an open society, and that was much more laborious and hard slugging. Education was clearly something where there were relatively few adverse consequences. So giving scholarships to outstanding talents, that was good and important. For instance, we introduced Head Start in all the countries where we have foundations, spent over $100 million doing it, and it was really questionable whether we would have a systemic effect. I think we have done quite well, but it was touch and go. Health, another issue, helping civil society. So it was a gradual learning process with foundations in each country run by people in the country who were in charge of determining how the money should be used, because they know the conditions in their countries better than somebody coming from the outside. And then seeing what works in one country, trying it in the other countries. So it was like a kind of what developed a matrix, in fact, that we had national foundations, and then we had certain specialized activities. I got here through a rather circuitous route, because I first started out in South Africa, which at that time had an apartheid regime, which had all the institutions of an open society, but it was only for the whites. So to try to open it up seemed like a very worthwhile objective. I wasn't very successful. And then I turned to my native Hungary and Poland and the countries of Eastern Europe that were under communist rule. And there, the foundation was really successful in providing an alternative. And the idea there was that the dogma, the state party line is false because it's imposed by force. And if you provide an alternative, then people can see the falsehood and the regime will crumble. And in fact, it did. As this system collapsed, I moved in to help build an open society, because the collapse of a closed society doesn't lead automatically to an open society, because open society is more complex. It's a higher level of organization. So you need a helping hand, a step up. You need somebody from the outside helping you to make that step up. And unfortunately, the West didn't quite realize this. And so I did, and I moved in there and concentrated on those countries, set up foundations locally, and they made their contribution. But then I became concerned with the problems of globalization, where you have global markets, but you have politics based on the sovereignty of states. So how do you deal with that issue? And then I came to the realization that open society is endangered by our current leadership in this country. And that is when I refocused my attention on the United States. September 11 was a traumatic event that shook the nation to its core. But it could not have changed the course of history for the worse if President Bush had not responded the way he did. Declaring war on terrorism was understandable, perhaps even appropriate as a figure of speech. But the President meant it literally, and that is when things started going seriously wrong.
You can ask any soldier, especially those who are out of uniform, and they'll tell you, put every other card on the table first. Use international law, diplomacy, economic suasion, high-level dialogue. Only use the military as a last resort. George Soros understands it because he lived it. He understands that it's diplomacy first. It's building common bridges and common interests between people and cultures that makes the world safe and that makes it prosperous for all of us. Not conquering territory at the point of a bayonet. That's the last resort when everything else has failed. All my experience in fostering democracy and open society has taught me that democracy can't be imposed by military means. And Iraq would be the last place I would choose for an experiment in introducing democracy, as the current chaos shows. There is a syndrome of victims turning perpetrators. Again, it's not terribly well recognized, but it is gaining some recognition. The war on terror has claimed more innocent victims than the terrorist attacks on September 11. This fact is not recognized at home because the victims of the war on terror are not Americans. But the rest of the world doesn't draw the same distinction, and world opinion has turned against us. So a tremendous gap in perceptions has opened up between us and the rest of the world. How come that in this country, where you have pluralistic media, you are able to mislead people to the extent that the media has misled the people during the Bush administration, particularly after September 11 and in the Iraqi war?
In the personal story segment tonight, as we mentioned in the talking points memo, left-wing extremist George Soros is heavily funding the Democratic presidential effort. And that might hurt Senator Kerry. Just yesterday, Soros told graduates at Columbia University that President Bush has killed more innocent people than the terrorists did on 9/11. Nice. With us now is Richard Poe, has investigated Soros for Newsmax magazine, a right-wing publication. All right, Mr. Poe, what did you find out about this guy?
George Soros is a madman. He's far beyond an extremist. He's a man who is dedicated to eradicating everything that our country represents to traditional, ordinary, I'll use the word conservative people.
All right. Well, we're going to stay on Soros, and believe me, Mr. Poe, people will know about this guy before the election.
I think it's so far off. I mean, it's so profoundly misrepresents what I stand for, that anybody who takes the trouble, so any of your listeners know that this is false. The trouble is that O'Reilly has 10 million listeners who don't listen to this channel. So how do you reach them?
Hello, George, good to see you. How you doing?
We once again have to become better citizens. You know, it is not enough for America's future that some participate and others don't. We have been given an extraordinary blessing, and at this moment in time, our country needs us. And we need people like George Soros, who is fearless and willing to step up when it counts. So please join me in welcoming George Soros.
It is the first time that I feel that I need to stand up and do something really and become really engaged in the electoral process in this country. The reason I feel that I had to get engaged is because I don't think this is a normal election. This is a referendum on the Bush administration's policies, the Bush doctrine, and its application, its first application, which was the invasion of Iraq. There was a group of people in the administration who used September 11 to implement policies that they believed in and were advocating before, but didn't have a mandate. They wanted to overturn Saddam in 1998. They wrote a letter to Clinton advocating it. And they have an ideology, which is that international relations are relations of power and not law. Law merely ratifies what the power has achieved, and we are powerful. Therefore, it is our duty to use that power. Now, this is a false ideology, but it is the one that has guided these people who were, in fact, the architects of the Iraqi invasion, because it was all done in the Pentagon with the support of Vice President Cheney. The terrible results, the failure in Iraq, that is now sort of public knowledge, and is expressed in the views that public opinion research. But the idea that there is really something wrong with the way we went about fighting terrorism hasn't sunk in. And we need to learn that lesson, because it really does lead to a vicious circle of escalating violence. Where it can lead, you see particularly in Israel-Palestine. And you don't want the world to be like that, and you don't want America to be caught in that.
Would-be suicide bomber.
If by some chance we re-elect Bush, then I think we are off to this vicious circle of escalating violence, because there will be increased resentment and rage against the United States, which will then result in us taking repressive actions, which will again have new victims, and feed into the rage. Now, it's very important to realize that the Iraqi involvement has been an utter disaster for the United States. Even in terms of the American supremacists who wanted to demonstrate America's military power. Actually, our military power has diminished. Our ability to project military force has been diminished because our army was not trained for occupation. It was trained to bring overwhelming power to bear. And the fact that we are now bogged down in Iraq reduces our military might. And of course, the damage that it has done to our standing in the world hardly needs to be explained. I'm really worried, particularly under the pressure of the forthcoming elections, that we are setting up for a Bosnian situation, because we are empowering the militias, and maybe they'll hold their fire until the elections, and then they'll start fighting for the oil. So Iraq probably cannot be maintained as a unitary state. Unfortunately, we'll probably get there first through civil war and then some kind of a settlement. And there's a great danger, you see, that Iraq could become a failed state and the base for terrorists. I mean, you know, Afghanistan is no longer available, or not to the same extent, so Iraq may actually become a hothouse of terrorism. In addition to focusing on that, we also have a tremendous responsibility to bring about a better world order, where people accept the dominant position that America occupies, because America actually lives up to the responsibility of being the leader and the architect, the main architect of the global system. And that will require a much more generous, much more far-sighted policy than what we have been following even under our previous presidents. We are the leading power in the world. That puts on, we are the most successful dominant economic power also. And that imposes on us a unique obligation to lead the world in improving the present world order, to correct the deficiencies of globalization, because we can't impose our will on the world. We can't do just whatever we want. But there can be no cooperative effort without our participation and leadership. How to deal with the likes of Saddam is the great unresolved problem of our world order. And the way we went about it makes it more difficult to deal with that problem. We must change that approach, but we must help to develop better methods of intervening when it is necessary. We mustn't turn away from the world, because we are increasingly interdependent, and what happens, what kind of regime prevails in Iraq or Afghanistan does have a great bearing on our security and on our prosperity. So we must develop ways of intervening when there is a repressive regime or a rogue state or a failed state. But we must do it. We cannot do it alone. We must do it in cooperation with others. Thank you.